Avoidance as a defense mechanism is rarely a conscious decision. It is a pattern shaped slowly over time, often beginning in early emotional experiences where vulnerability was met with rejection, unpredictability, or emotional neglect. The psyche, in its attempt to survive, learns that closeness may lead to pain. From that moment, distance becomes a strategy. The individual does not wake up one day and decide to withdraw from intimacy. Rather, they internalize the belief that self-protection must come before connection. This belief settles deep within the unconscious and begins to guide behavior in subtle ways. When someone approaches with emotional openness, the avoidant feels tension instead of comfort. Their body tightens, their thoughts search for escape routes, and their heart convinces them that retreat equals safety. Over time, this response becomes automatic. They may appear calm, independent, even emotionally strong, yet beneath this surface lies a constant vigilance against being exposed. The tragedy is that the very mechanism designed to prevent suffering also prevents fulfillment. Relationships require presence, risk, and mutual vulnerability. When one partner consistently withdraws at the first sign of depth, the connection weakens. The avoidant individual may rationalize their behavior by labeling others as too demanding or too sensitive, but internally they sense a recurring pattern. They leave before being left. They detach before becoming attached. They silence emotions before those emotions grow powerful enough to challenge their control. This pattern provides temporary relief, but creates long-term emptiness. The defense mechanism becomes a barrier not only against pain, but against love, trust, and growth. To understand avoidance, one must see it not as coldness, but as fear disguised as strength. The engaging truth is that behind the distance is often a person who longs deeply for connection, yet does not know how to remain present when it begins to matter. Real change starts when the avoidant recognizes that their withdrawal is not proof of independence, but evidence of unresolved fear. When they begin to question the origin of their reflex to retreat, awareness replaces automatic reaction. In that awareness lies the first step toward transformation, where protection is no longer confused with isolation and where courage gradually replaces avoidance. Regret in the avoidant personality does not arrive loudly. It does not storm the mind with immediate confession or dramatic remorse. Instead, it moves quietly, like a shadow stretching longer as the light shifts. At first, the avoidant justifies their withdrawal. They tell themselves that distance was necessary, that emotional intensity was overwhelming, that leaving preserved peace. In the moment, retreat feels rational and even empowering. Yet time has a way of dissolving these justifications. When the emotional threat has passed and the silence settles, memory begins to speak. The mind replays conversations that were cut short, messages left unanswered, and expressions of care that were dismissed too quickly. These memories do not accuse, they linger. The avoidant individual may feel an unexpected heaviness when reminded of someone they pushed away. A song, a familiar place, or a quiet evening can awaken the awareness that something meaningful was abandoned, not because it lacked value, but because it required vulnerability. This is where regret begins to form. It is not simply sadness over loss. It is the recognition of personal responsibility in that loss. For someone accustomed to emotional distance, this recognition is unsettling. It challenges the carefully constructed identity of independence. The ego resists by offering explanations. It was not the right time. The other person expected too much. Circumstances were complicated. Yet beneath these explanations lies a deeper truth that cannot be silenced forever. The avoidant knows at some level that fear guided their choice. This awareness creates internal tension. They may hesitate to reach out, unsure whether repair is possible or whether pride should remain intact. Regret then becomes a private burden, carried silently. It may surface in dreams, in sudden waves of nostalgia, or in moments of comparison when new relationships fail in similar ways. Patterns repeat, and with each repetition, the realization grows stronger. The avoidant begins to see that the common thread in their disappointments is not fate, but their own withdrawal. This is a difficult insight, yet it is also powerful. Regret, when acknowledged rather than suppressed, becomes an invitation to growth. It reveals that the pain of vulnerability might have been less destructive than the pain of absence. In recognizing this, the avoidant stands at a crossroads. They can either reinforce their defenses and continue the cycle, or they can allow regret to teach them. When regret is faced honestly, it transforms from a haunting presence into a guide that points toward accountability, emotional courage, and the possibility of doing differently in the future. At the center of avoidant behavior lies a deep and often unspoken fear of intimacy. This fear is not simply discomfort with closeness. It is a profound anxiety about losing oneself within another. The avoidant individual equates emotional dependence with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. In early experiences, closeness may have felt unpredictable, overwhelming, or unsafe. As a result, the psyche formed a belief that autonomy must be protected at all costs. When someone begins to care deeply for them, instead of feeling secure, they feel exposed. The expectations of mutual sharing, emotional availability, and consistent presence can feel like demands that threaten their independence. They may interpret normal relational needs as pressure, even when no control is being imposed. Internally, their thoughts shift towards self-preservation. They question whether they are being confined, whether their freedom is shrinking, whether their identity will dissolve into the relationship. This perception does not necessarily match reality, yet it feels intensely real to them. Consequently, they begin to create space. They delay responses, limit emotional conversations, or immerse themselves in work and distractions. To an outside observer, this may appear detached or indifferent. However, within the avoidant, there is tension. One part desires the warmth and stability of connection. Another part fears that surrendering to intimacy will erase the boundaries that keep them safe. This internal struggle creates a cycle. As closeness increases, anxiety rises. As anxiety rises, distance follows. And as distance grows, the relationship weakens. Ironically, the very act meant to preserve identity ultimately isolates the self further. Over time, the avoidant may notice a pattern of relationships that fade just as they begin to deepen. They may feel misunderstood, believing that others expect too much, yet they also sense that something within them consistently pulls away. The fear of losing oneself becomes stronger than the desire to build something lasting. Understanding this dynamic is essential. The fear of engulfment is not proof that intimacy is harmful. It is evidence of unresolved insecurity. True connection does not require surrendering individuality. Healthy intimacy allows two distinct identities to coexist, not merge into one indistinguishable whole. When the avoidant begins to recognize that closeness can enhance rather than threaten their sense of self, a shift becomes possible. Instead of viewing emotional interdependence as weakness, they may gradually see it as strength. This realization does not eliminate fear overnight, but it opens the door to conscious choice. By remaining present in moments of discomfort rather than escaping them, the avoidant can discover that intimacy, when balanced, does not erase identity, but deepens it. Within the avoidant individual, there exists a quiet but persistent inner conflict. On one side stands the longing for connection, the natural human desire to be seen, understood, and valued without pretense. On the other side stands the impulse to retreat, to maintain distance, to remain emotionally self-contained. These two forces do not operate peacefully. They compete. When the avoidant meets someone who awakens genuine feeling, hope begins to rise. They imagine companionship, shared experiences, emotional safety. For a moment, they allow themselves to lean forward. Yet almost simultaneously, a warning signal activates within. Questions appear. What if this becomes overwhelming? What if expectations increase? What if I lose control? The body responds with subtle anxiety. The mind searches for flaws or reasons to slow down. This push and pull creates inconsistency in behavior. One day they may be attentive and warm, the next distant and distracted. To others, this shift feels confusing. To the avoidant, it feels like survival. They are not consciously trying to create instability. They are attempting to manage two opposing needs that feel equally urgent. The tragedy of this inner conflict is that it prevents clarity. The avoidant rarely pauses long enough to observe the pattern from a distance. Instead, they react in the moment, guided by whichever force feels stronger at that time. If loneliness becomes intense, they move closer. If vulnerability becomes too visible, they withdraw. Over time, this rhythm exhausts both themselves and those around them. The inner tension can manifest as irritability, overthinking, or emotional numbness. They may tell themselves that relationships are inherently complicated without recognizing that much of the complication arises from unresolved fear within. Engaging with this conflict requires honesty. The avoidant must acknowledge that the desire for connection is real and not a weakness. At the same time, they must explore the origin of their fear rather than allowing it to dictate action. When they begin to observe the internal dialogue instead of automatically obeying it, awareness grows. They start to notice the exact moment when closeness triggers anxiety. In that moment lies an opportunity. Instead of retreating, they can choose to remain present and communicate their discomfort. This does not eliminate fear immediately, but it reduces the chaos of inconsistency. By integrating these opposing forces rather than letting them battle unconsciously, the avoidant moves toward emotional maturity. The inner conflict becomes less of a war and more of a conversation, where both the need for independence and the need for intimacy can coexist without destroying one another. Pride often becomes the silent guardian of the avoidant personality. It stands at the threshold of vulnerability and refuses entry to anything that might expose weakness. For the avoidant individual, admitting emotional need can feel like surrendering power. They may have learned early in life that self-reliance ensured safety, while dependence invited disappointment. As a result, the ego constructs a strong image of independence. They take pride in handling problems alone, in not appearing overly emotional, in maintaining composure when others might openly express hurt. On the surface, this appears admirable. Yet beneath this controlled exterior lies an unspoken fear of being seen in a fragile state. When conflict arises in relationships, pride interferes with repair. Instead of admitting that they withdrew too quickly or reacted defensively, they justify their behavior. They focus on the other person's flaws or amplify minor issues to protect their self-image. Apologizing feels threatening because it requires acknowledging that fear influenced their actions. The ego resists this acknowledgement, convincing them that standing firm is strength. However, this rigid stance creates emotional distance. The partner may wait for reassurance or accountability, but the avoidant remains silent, believing that time alone will resolve tension. In reality, unresolved misunderstandings deepen the divide. Over time, pride begins to isolate the individual from meaningful connection. They may sense that something valuable is slipping away, yet they hesitate to soften their stance. The inner voice that whispers, "You could reach out, you could admit this mattered," is quickly overshadowed by another voice insisting, "Do not lose dignity, do not appear needy." This internal resistance reinforces the pattern of avoidance. Engaging with this dynamic requires courage. True strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to remain present despite it. When the avoidant begins to question whether pride is protecting them or imprisoning them, awareness shifts. They may recognize that maintaining a flawless self-image has cost them closeness and understanding. Humility becomes the turning point. To say, "I was afraid," or "I did not handle this well," does not diminish identity. Instead, it humanizes it. Relationships grow not through perfection, but through accountability. By allowing pride to soften, the avoidant opens space for reconciliation and deeper trust. The walls built to defend the ego can gradually transform into bridges that connect. In this transformation, the individual learns that dignity is not lost through honesty. It is strengthened by it. Projection and blame often serve as subtle extensions of avoidance. When the avoidant individual feels discomfort rising within a relationship, it can be easier to attribute that discomfort to the other person rather than examine its true origin. If a partner expresses a desire for more closeness, reassurance, or communication, the avoidant may interpret these needs as excessive. They may describe the other as demanding, overly emotional, or dependent. In doing so, they shift attention away from their own anxiety about intimacy. This process is rarely deliberate. It unfolds quietly within the psyche as a way of preserving self-image. By focusing on external faults, they avoid confronting the internal fear that closeness awakens. Blame becomes a shield that keeps self-reflection at a distance. The narrative forms gradually. The relationship did not work because the other person required too much, because they created pressure, because they failed to understand boundaries. While there may be moments when boundaries truly were crossed, the consistent pattern of assigning responsibility outward prevents growth. Over time, similar scenarios repeat. Different people enter their lives, yet the same complaints surface. This repetition can create confusion. The avoidant may wonder why they continually encounter partners who seem intense or emotionally expressive. What remains unseen is that their perception filters experience through the lens of fear. When intimacy deepens, the internal alarm activates. Instead of acknowledging the alarm as their own, they interpret it as evidence that something is wrong with the other person. Engaging with this pattern requires courage and honesty. The avoidant must ask themselves whether the discomfort they feel is proportionate to the situation or amplified by past wounds. They must consider the possibility that the demand they perceive is not an attack on autonomy, but an invitation to connection. Accepting this does not mean accepting unhealthy behavior from others. It means distinguishing between genuine boundary violations and internal resistance to vulnerability. When responsibility shifts inward in a balanced and thoughtful way, clarity emerges. The avoidant begins to see that some of the conflict they attributed to others originated within themselves. This realization can be uncomfortable, yet it is liberating. By reclaiming ownership of their reactions, they regain the power to change them. Projection dissolves when self-awareness strengthens. In place of blame, there is accountability. And in accountability, there is the possibility of forming relationships that are not repeatedly shaped by the same unconscious defenses. Pain often becomes the turning point for the avoidant individual, even though it is the very experience they have spent years trying to escape. When distance repeatedly leads to loss, when connections dissolve just as they begin to deepen, and when loneliness grows heavier than the fear of closeness, something shifts internally. The protective strategies that once felt effective begin to reveal their limitations. The avoidant may notice a pattern of unfinished stories in their life, relationships that ended not because love was absent, but because vulnerability felt unbearable. At first, this awareness may bring discomfort or even shame. They might replay past moments, recognizing where a conversation could have been continued, where reassurance could have been offered, where staying would have required courage. This reflection can be painful because it challenges the belief that withdrawal was always the safest choice. Yet pain has a clarifying quality. It strips away excuses and exposes truth. The avoidant begins to see that the strategy of self-protection has also been a strategy of self-limitation. The loneliness they experience is not simply the result of fate, but of repeated retreat. This realization is not meant to condemn, but to awaken. When pain is acknowledged rather than suppressed, it becomes instructive. It asks important questions. What am I truly afraid of? Where did this fear originate? Is the present situation truly as dangerous as my mind suggests? Engaging with these questions requires patience and self-compassion. The avoidant must resist the impulse to numb or distract themselves from discomfort. Instead, they can observe their emotional responses with curiosity rather than judgment. In doing so, they begin to uncover earlier experiences that shaped their defenses. Perhaps closeness once led to disappointment or unpredictability. Perhaps emotional expression was discouraged or dismissed. Understanding these origins does not excuse present behavior, but it provides context. Pain, when approached consciously, becomes a teacher. It reveals that growth is not found in constant retreat, but in measured risk. The avoidant learns that remaining present during emotional discomfort does not result in collapse. On the contrary, it builds resilience. Gradually, they discover that the fear of vulnerability is often greater than the vulnerability itself. Through repeated acts of staying, speaking, and feeling, the cycle begins to weaken. Pain no longer serves only as a warning signal, but as a guide toward deeper self-awareness and healthier connection. In this transformation, avoidance loses its dominance and intentional engagement begins to take its place. Integration and responsibility mark the final and most essential stage in the transformation of the avoidant individual. After recognizing patterns of withdrawal, confronting regret, and understanding the roots of fear, there comes a moment when insight must become action. Awareness alone does not change behavior. It illuminates it. The avoidant must decide whether to continue operating from unconscious defense or to step into deliberate choice. Integration means accepting that both the desire for independence and the longing for connection are valid parts of the self. Neither must dominate the other. For years, avoidance may have protected fragile aspects of identity, but now those aspects require strengthening rather than shielding. Responsibility begins with simple acknowledgments. I withdrew when I was afraid. I misinterpreted closeness as control. I allowed pride to silence honesty. These statements are not confessions of failure. They are declarations of maturity. By owning past actions without harsh self-condemnation, the avoidant reclaims agency. Instead of blaming circumstances or other people, they recognize their role in shaping outcomes. This shift changes how future relationships unfold. When anxiety arises, they can name it rather than act it out through distance. When conflict appears, they can communicate rather than disappear. Integration also requires consistency. It is not a single moment of courage, but a series of small, repeated choices to remain present. The avoidant learns to tolerate the discomfort that once triggered retreat. They discover that vulnerability, expressed gradually and honestly, does not erase identity. It strengthens mutual trust. Responsibility extends beyond words into behavior. Apologies are followed by change. Promises are supported by effort. Over time, this steady commitment reshapes self-perception. The avoidant no longer sees themselves as someone who must escape to survive. They begin to view themselves as capable of enduring emotional intensity without losing balance. This internal stability fosters healthier connections. Others feel safer because presence replaces unpredictability. Most importantly, the individual experiences a new sense of wholeness. Integration unites previously divided parts of the psyche. Fear is acknowledged but not obeyed blindly. Independence remains intact, yet it coexists with intimacy rather than opposing it. Through responsibility, the avoidant transforms regret into wisdom. They understand that growth is not about erasing the past, but learning from it. In choosing accountability over denial, they step into a more conscious way of relating, where connection is approached not with panic but with intention and courage. Emotional maturity for the avoidant individual begins when self-awareness deepens into consistent self-regulation. It is one thing to recognize patterns of withdrawal, it is another to interrupt them in real time. Many avoidant individuals can reflect clearly after distance has already created damage. They can articulate why they felt overwhelmed, why they shut down, why they needed space. However, growth requires learning to pause in the very moment anxiety rises. Emotional maturity involves noticing the tightening in the chest, the sudden urge to delay a message, the impulse to minimize a meaningful conversation. Instead of obeying these impulses automatically, the individual practices slowing down. They ask themselves whether the present situation truly threatens their identity or whether it merely activates an old fear. This pause creates psychological space. In that space, choice becomes possible. Self-regulation does not mean suppressing emotion. It means responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. The avoidant begins to understand that discomfort is not an emergency. Intense feelings do not require immediate escape. They can be experienced, examined, and communicated. This shift transforms relationships. Instead of disappearing during conflict, the individual might say, "I am feeling overwhelmed and need a moment, but I am not leaving." Such statements build trust because they combine honesty with commitment. Emotional maturity also includes empathy. The avoidant learns to consider how their withdrawal affects others. They recognize that silence can feel like rejection, and that inconsistency can create insecurity. By acknowledging this impact, they strengthen accountability. Over time, repeated acts of presence reshape internal beliefs. The mind gradually learns that closeness does not equal loss of self, and that emotional intensity can be navigated without collapse. This development requires patience. Patterns formed over years do not dissolve overnight. There may still be moments of retreat, but they become less frequent and shorter in duration. What once felt like an uncontrollable reflex becomes a manageable signal. The avoidant no longer views vulnerability as a threat to autonomy, but as a skill to be practiced with care. Through steady self-regulation, they build confidence in their ability to remain engaged. Emotional maturity is not the absence of fear. It is the capacity to move forward despite it. In cultivating this capacity, the avoidant shifts from defensive living to intentional relating, creating space for stability, depth, and genuine connection.